Somewhere in the wooded hills of the Catskill Mountains in New York State, there is a fortune buried in the ground that has never been recovered, and the man who put it there was murdered before he could ever come back for it. 9 decades have passed since that fortune vanished from sight, and treasure hunters with shovels, metal detectors, and radar equipment have combed the same hillsides for generations without finding a single trace of it. The man who buried it was one of the most feared and wealthy criminals in American history, and his death remains one of the most famous killings ever carried out by organized crime. His real name was Arthur Flegenheimer, and he was born on August 6, 1901 in the Bronx section of New York City to German Jewish immigrants named Hermann and Emma. His father abandoned the family when Arthur was still a boy, and the experience left him bitter for the rest of his life. He grew up poor on the streets of the Bronx and turned to burglary as a teenager. He was arrested and sent to a prison on Blackwell's Island in the East River, where he proved too difficult for the staff to control. He was transferred to a work farm from which he escaped, and after he was recaptured, his sentence was extended. When he returned to the neighborhood, his old friends gave him a new name borrowed from a deceased strong-arm man known for his dirty fighting tactics. From that point forward, Arthur Flegenheimer was known to the world as Dutch Schultz. In the mid-1920s, Schultz took work as a bouncer inside a small speakeasy in the Bronx, owned by a small-time gangster named Joey Noe. The two men quickly realized how much money could be made selling illegal alcohol during Prohibition, and they built their own bootlegging operation together, supplying beer and liquor to speakeasies across the borough. Within a few years, their business was worth millions of dollars, and Schultz earned a reputation as a violent and ruthless operator who would kidnap and torture rival gangsters who stood in his way. When Schultz and Noe pushed their operation into Manhattan, they ran into a powerful rival named Jack Diamond, known on the street as Legs. The rivalry turned deadly in October 1928 when gunmen working for Diamond ambushed Noe outside a nightclub on 54th Street. Noe was wearing a bulletproof vest and did not die instantly, but his wounds proved fatal, and he died about a month later. Schultz was devastated by the loss of his partner and mentor, and he responded with more violence, expanding his territory and eliminating anyone who threatened his growing empire. Rumors spread that he had a hand in the killing of a well-known gambler named Arnold Rothstein, who was tied to Diamond, though that claim was never proven. By the end of the decade, Schultz was supplying speakeasies across the Bronx with $2 million worth of alcohol every year, and he had become one of the most powerful bootleggers in New York City. Diamond himself was gunned down in Albany, New York in December of 1931, reportedly on orders connected to Schultz, though it was never officially confirmed. Schultz still faced threats from within his own organization. One of his top enforcers, a young gunman named Vincent Call, demanded to be made an equal partner in the business, and when Schultz refused, Call broke away and formed his own crew with the goal of killing Schultz and taking his territory by force. The war between the two men turned into one of the bloodiest gang conflicts New York had ever seen. Call lost his own brother Peter during the fighting and earned the nickname Mad Dog from newspapers after a botched assassination attempt by his gang ended with a 5-year-old child shot and killed in the crossfire on a Harlem street. The war finally ended in February of 1932 when Schultz's men lured Call into a drugstore telephone booth on West 23rd Street in Manhattan and opened fire with a machine gun, killing him instantly. When Prohibition ended in 1933, Schultz needed a new source of income, and he founded in the Harlem numbers racket, a type of illegal lottery that working-class residents played every day, hoping to turn a few coins into real money. Schultz brought in a middle-aged accountant named Otto Berman, known on the street as Abadaba, for his lightning-fast mathematical mind. Berman could calculate in seconds exactly how much money needed to be bet at the racetrack at the last possible moment to manipulate the winning number and guarantee that Schultz's operation always came out ahead. Berman was paid $10,000 a week for his skill, and the scheme brought Schultz a fortune that ran into the millions every single month, completely tax-free. Schultz also built a restaurant extortion racket using beatings and stink bomb attacks to force restaurant and cafeteria owners across the city into a union association he controlled. Schultz's growing wealth eventually drew the attention of federal investigators, and in 1933 he was indicted for income tax evasion. Rather than face arrest immediately, Schultz went underground and lived as a fugitive for roughly 2 years, moving between hideouts while his lawyers fought to delay his trial. His first trial ended in a hung jury, and for his second trial, his attorneys had the case moved to the small town of Malone, New York, near the Canadian border. Schultz spent weeks in the town beforehand playing the role of a generous country gentleman, handing out toys to children and making donations to local businesses and churches. The strategy worked, and in 1935, a jury in Malone acquitted him, despite what most observers considered overwhelming evidence against him. New York City's mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, was furious over the verdict and publicly banned Schultz from ever returning to the city, forcing him to relocate his operations across the river to Newark, New Jersey. The years of legal trouble had taken a toll on Schultz's organization and on his own state of mind. He grew increasingly paranoid and violent toward the men around him. One of his most trusted enforcers, a gunman named Bo Weinberg, secretly met with a rising Sicilian crime boss named Charlie Luciano, known as Lucky, to discuss the possibility of taking over Schultz's operations while Schultz was tied up in his legal battles. When Schultz learned of the betrayal, he had Weinberg killed personally, according to underworld legend, disposing of his body so thoroughly that it was never recovered. By 1935, Schultz faced an even bigger threat in the form of a 33-year-old special prosecutor named Thomas Dewey, who had been appointed by the governor of New York to crush organized crime in the city. Dewey was relentless, and Schultz knew that another indictment was coming that could send him to prison for good. Desperate to save himself, Schultz called an emergency meeting with the commission, the ruling council of organized crime bosses that had been formed by Luciano, and included men such as Meyer Lansky, Lepke Buchalter, Jacob Shapiro, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese. Schultz proposed that the group kill Dewey before he could destroy them all. The commission refused, fearing that murdering a prosecutor of Dewey's stature would bring the full force of the government down on every one of them. Schultz stormed out of the meeting furious and declared that he would kill Dewey with or without their permission. He asked Albert Anastasia, the head of the crime organization's enforcement squad, later nicknamed Murder Incorporated, to begin watching Dewey's apartment building on Fifth Avenue. Anastasia reported the request straight back to Luciano, and the commission made its decision. Rather than risk the chaos that a dead prosecutor would bring down on their operations across the country, the bosses agreed that Schultz himself needed to be eliminated first. The contract went to two Murder Incorporated gunmen named Charles Workman, known as the Bug, and Emmanuel Weiss, known as Mendy, acting under the direction of crime boss Lepke Buchalter. On the night of October 23, 1935, Schultz and three of his closest men, Otto Berman, Abe Landau, and Bernard Rosenkrantz, known as Lulu, walked from their hotel in Newark to a nearby restaurant called the Palace Chop House to eat dinner and review the numbers ledgers from that day. Around 10:15 that night, Workman and Weiss walked into the restaurant. Workman made his way toward the men's room where Schultz had stepped away and shot him once in the side with a .45 caliber pistol. At the same moment, Weiss opened fire in the dining room, killing Berman almost instantly and critically wounding both Landau and Rosenkrantz. Schultz staggered out of the restroom bleeding and collapsed at a table rather than die on the bathroom floor. Across the river in Manhattan, other gunmen connected to the same operation tracked down two more of Schultz's associates, Martin Krompier and Sam Gold, and shot them in the city's theater district that same night. All four wounded men from the Palace Chop House were rushed to Newark City Hospital. Rosenkrantz and Landau died from their wounds within 2 days. Schultz clung to life the longest as the bullet had torn through his internal organs and infection began to spread through his body. On the afternoon of October 24th, a police stenographer arrived at his bedside as a police sergeant attempted to question him about who was responsible for the shooting. Schultz drifted in and out of consciousness with a raging fever, and the words that came out of him made almost no sense at all. He mentioned names like John and referred repeatedly to someone he called the boss, but investigators could never connect the fragments to anyone with certainty, and both of the men most commonly suspected had solid alibis, placing them out of state at the time of the shooting. Before he died, Schultz converted to the Catholic faith and received last rites from a local priest. He died on October 24, 1935, at 34 years old without ever naming the men who killed him. Unlike most major killings in the underworld, Schultz's death did not spark a war between rival gangs. His rackets were quietly absorbed by other operators around the city, including members of Luciano's growing network, and the intense media coverage of the murder turned public and law enforcement attention toward Luciano himself, who would be convicted on unrelated charges the following year. Schultz was buried at Gate of Heaven Cemetery north of New York City, leaving behind an operation built on bootleg liquor and rigged lottery numbers. What Schultz also left behind, according to his own lawyer, was a fortune that nobody has ever been able to find. The attorney who represented Schultz during his tax evasion case later told a magazine reporter that in 1933, while awaiting trial and fearing prison, Schultz packed a steel strongbox with cash, bonds, and diamonds worth somewhere between $5 and $9 million at the time, an amount that would be worth tens of millions of dollars today. According to the story, Schultz and his bodyguard Lulu Rosencrantz drove the box into the Catskill Mountains near the small town of Phoenicia, New York, close to a waterway called Esopus Creek, an area Schultz knew well from his old bootlegging roots, and buried it somewhere in the woods. Some of the confused statements Schultz made on his deathbed have been interpreted over the years as clues pointing back toward that same area, including mentions of driving back to Phoenicia and references that some believe pointed toward a nearby rock formation known as Devil's Tombstone. Word of a hidden fortune spread quickly after his death, and police reportedly searched the hills around Phoenicia elbow to elbow, turning up nothing more than an old truck door and pieces of a broken-down moonshine still. Rosencrantz is said to have sketched a map marked with symbols meant for a fellow associate before he died of his own wounds 2 days after the shooting, leaving whatever knowledge he had incomplete and impossible to follow. In the decades since, nearly every serious attempt to find the buried fortune has come up empty, despite the use of metal detectors, backhoes, ground-penetrating radar, and even psychics brought in by hopeful searchers. A television documentary released in 2020 followed 3 separate teams using modern scanning technology across the same hillsides, and even tracked down a man then age 104 who had been one of the last living associates connected to Schultz's operation. Even with every modern tool available, the fortune has never surfaced. Nearly 90 years after Dutch Schultz bled out in a Newark hospital bed rambling about mothers and appointments and a boss no one could identify, his millions are still believed to be sitting somewhere beneath the trees of the Catskill Mountains, waiting for someone to finally dig in the right spot.